right now I've just got one last job, and that's to hand over to Roger. So Roger, over to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Good. Well, thanks for coming, everybody. It's really nice, and thanks for inviting me. Numinous team, it's really good, and looking forward to being leading the retreat in April. So I'll just see if I can do share my PowerPoint. No, that's not working. Let me just try again. Right, can you see that? Danny?
Yes, we can see that.
You can see that. Great, good.
Thank you.
Good. Okay. Yeah, so thanks for coming, everybody. This is my talk. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, which will give you a kind of overview of what this topic is about, which is really about integrating ecopsychotherapy and psychedelics. And I'll tell you a little bit about what that means and what my journey has been on that as we go. So, so what I'm going to explore will be an introduction to ecopsychotherapy and nature connection, as it is, because that's not a familiar topic to everybody. Psychedelics as a tool for nature connection, sometimes called ecodelia. And then something about decolonizing our understanding of both psychedelics and nature, which I'll explain a bit as we go. And then finally, working with traditional and contemporary psychotechnologies to reconnect nature with the Great Mother. With nature as the Great Mother. In other words, how do we connect deeply with nature? Move that one. So my journey into this work, I started off as a biologist. I had a degree in biology. I had a very strong connection with nature when I was a kid, and everyone thought, well, you've got to become a biologist and study biology. And when I studied biology, I realized that the thing that I was looking for in nature wasn't in biology. It was something else, or it wasn't captured by biology, as it were. So from that, after finishing my degree, I realized I didn't want to be a biologist. I got into traveling. I traveled in Africa for quite a bit and became a teacher. Then I worked outside with adolescents in a project, and so connecting sort of teaching in nature, and all the time trying to figure out what this nature connection was. From this picture, you can see also the Liberty caps. So when I was at university, as many people did, I experienced Liberty caps, and I was studying invertebrate biology at that time, and actually had an amazing experience of some sort of connection in nature, some sort of patterns in nature that weren't really in the biology textbooks. So I've written about this, and in the last 4 years or so, I've trained as a psychedelic integration therapist with PHP, and subsequently working with Numinous Ways. So my experience through that early psychedelic experience was that everything was connected in a way that people weren't really talking about, mainly through fractal spirals, and I suppose that led me into really wanting to explore how nature worked, or what this story that wasn't getting heard in biology was. That led me into Waldorf education, Steiner education, and there I came across the works of Rudolf Steiner, who described biology he described this kind of spiritual biology, which was quite complicated, but I spent quite a bit of time kind of figuring out what that meant and getting a sense of that. So that led me into this project, Ruskin Mill, where I worked for about 20 years with complex adolescents outside in nature, I did woodland management. That's me on the log there. So basically embodying young people in nature and finding that was transformative experience. We also took young people out into the wilderness. You can see the yurt there, which is the base camp for our wilderness immersions, which were 10 days out in Scotland. And again, exposing young people to nature had a transformative effect. And I went on to, as I said, to write and lecture in the field of ecopsychotherapy, the integration of nature and psychotherapy, as it were, and developed 2 courses for Confer. One of them, this one here, Ecopsychotherapy in the Emerging Adolescent Mind. So ecopsychotherapy, it's a bit of a clunky word. It's a bit better than ecopsychology, which is an American version. And it really came out of the I think the 70s and 80s, where people realized that psychology, as it was called in America, psychotherapy, and ecology weren't really talking to each other because they'd gone down different kind of silos. So the question is, well, how do you bring these 2 together? It's a very, very broad field, but essentially it's about weaving together nature connection, our understanding of nature, and our understanding of mental health. So as I said, there are a number of different ways into this work, but one is through body-based work and nature-based work. In other words, taking people outside, either for kind of focused therapy sessions or prolonged sessions like gardening. This is the farming we did at Ruskin Mill, and there's three components in this that seem to the evidence points to 3 important things. One is working outside, in other words, being in contact with nature. The social group is really important. So it's not about just going out on your own, although it can be that. Being in a social group, supportive social group, is really important. And it also has to have a meaningful context. In other words, you're not just messing around, you're not just stroking rabbits, you're actually doing something that has a shared, if you like, a shared purpose. And again, if you think about indigenous cultures, this is what human beings have been doing forever, working outside in social groups in a meaningful context, which is about getting food, building shelter, ceremony, all those things. So it doesn't really, it's not really surprising that this is hugely effective. So this is another aspect of ecopsychotherapy, which I've been involved in, as I mentioned before. Wilderness experience, and again, I learned from a teacher in Sweden who started taking whole groups into the mountains in Sweden, into Sarak National Park, which is way up in Sweden, and he would take them in a minibus, drop them off, and then they would drop a motorbike. That's right, they'll drop a motorbike at the other end of the park, and then take the kids and drop them off, leave the minibus, and then they'd all walk for about 10 days, 15 days with all their food, and then he would jump on the motorbike, go back and get the minibus. And what he found is that these young people completely changed through the experience, through being exposed to nature, and that was, I found that fascinating. So that's really one of the things I started to explore. And also came across, quite a few other eco-psychologists who were saying interesting stuff, like Robert Greenaway. He says, Western culture is only 3 days deep. And what he realized was when you take people, what he experienced, in fact, is when you take people out into nature for more than 3 days and nights, our whole body starts to calm down. Not our whole body, but our whole psyche starts to calm down. So our dreams change, and we kind of tune in to nature in a completely different way. That's quite difficult to do in our culture because we're kind of bombarded by the man-made world. This was a trip. This was a trip I did to the Pyrenees a couple of years ago now, and I had exactly that experience walking in the Pyrenees. The first 4 or 5 days, my mind was kind of buzzing around with lots of different things, weird dreams, and then my dreams started to consolidate and kind of speak to me in a really archetypal, big dream, Jungian, in a Jungian sort of way. And that linked in actually with. I was able to pick up on some of those messages in psychedelic experiences later on. So finding nature connection, the man in terms of nature connection is this guy, Miles Richardson, who's written a book called Reconnection. And he's done a lot of research on this, and what he finds is that the connection with nature is not through the intellect. It's not about learning the names of stuff and all of that. He said, you have to engage with nature through our senses and emotions, appreciating beauty and meaning, and developing a deep compassion and care for the natural world. And also, Ros Watts has also come in through the psychedelic world, if you like, has developed this connectedness scale through psychedelic experience. And there's a kind of link from sort of attachment, connection to self, connection to others, to ecopsychotherapy, sort of connection to the world and connection to nature. And she's got a tool for measuring that. So there's this sort of, there's this conversation that's developing about psychedelics, nature connection, and it's sort of going, well, what's important? How are we going to reconnect with nature? One of the interesting things about Miles Richardson's work is he's not a psychotherapist. He's not an adolescent psychotherapist. He's a social scientist. And so what he says in his book is that during adolescence, that there's a dip in nature connection, which he calls the adolescent dip, which means that when kids are when kids are small, they really like going outside, finding bugs, looking at plants. When they become adolescents, when we become adolescents, that changes. We pull away from the kind of fascination with the external world, and he's saying, well, that's a bit of a problem in terms of what he's measuring, because he's trying to measure nature connection in terms of how people connect with plants and things. But what happens is that is replaced at adolescence with an intense interest that we all know from adolescence, from our children and from ourselves, of the initiatory nature of our own inner nature. So it's as if our interest in nature moves from the outside, moves to the inside. And of course, this traditionally was a time of initiation in indigenous cultures, when adolescence kicked in. It was time to initiate young people into a much deeper aspect of nature, which we've lost in our culture. But we still see the shadow of that, which is this intense interest in sexuality and embodiment in adolescence, interest in mind-altering substances quite often, interested in music and ecstatic dance, and risk-taking, all of which have this quality of initiatory experience, in initiatory experience, which is also connected with nature. So that's all well and good, but how do we find a way to connect with deeper nature? So that's what Miles Richardson has written his book about. And what he's looking at is trying to find social structures to do that, schools, programs that connect people to nature. And again, he's still stuck on this adolescent dip, what to do about adolescents, because it feels like they're pulling away from nature and actually they're interested in partying, and that's not really doesn't really fit the model. So I've been writing about this. I'm actually on to my second book, and this is been thinking about this, and basically one of the things I'm looking at is language and maps and territories in terms of getting to this inner work, because a lot of where we're stuck, or what prevents us from going deep on nature, is the language. And that's what you see in Miles Richardson's works to a certain extent. He's stuck on kind of biological language rather than psychological initiatory language. So these are three things we're going to look at. One is the healing the traumatic legacy of colonization. It's not an obvious route at all. Restoring the world, and then how to actually reconnect with nature. So what's becoming clear if you listen to the right podcast and read the right books is the Western world is suffering from a kind of post-colonial problem. In other words, a lot of the colonial mindset that created the slave trade and the exploitation of the southern hemisphere is based in language and perception of the northern hemisphere. In other words, a kind of post-enlightenment view of the world, where, and you remember, enlightenment was this sense of being able to understand the world. We can understand the world if we think about it, but it's a very disembodied perspective. And this is Vanessa Andriotti, who's written this fantastic book called Hospicing Modernity, highly recommend it. And she says colonialism, she sees colonialism not as a sort of a political problem, but she says colonialism is an unprocessed neurological impairment in our patterns of attachment. So she's saying this is about attachment, this is about connection with nature. So suddenly we're going, oh, so is this an ecopsychotherapy issue? Well, yes, it is. So, and what she talks about is moving away from describing the world, indexing the world through language, thinking about the world. So what we find in most Western ologies, biology, psychology, is categorization of the world. I've just been in a session today, and the girl was saying, "Oh, have I got autism? Do I need an autistic assessment?" So it's about getting things into nouns. Oh, you've got autism. You haven't. You've got ADHD. Oh, this is this kind of plant. This is that. So what that does, it keeps us in our heads, and it prevents us dropping into this more felt sense of nature. So she describes this idea of thinking with the world somatically, exploring the relationship between language and reality, and bringing the world into being by the way we respond within it. So there's something here that again touches a little bit on the psychedelic experience. Is actually it's not just describing an experience, it's having a somatic experience which actually you can't describe. So and a lot of her work is informed by indigenous practice, actually, from down in the Amazon. So the other thing we need to think about is restoring the world. In other words, have we got, when we're thinking about nature connection and psychedelics, because psychedelics is mostly, most of the discourses around psychedelics are around the medical model, healing trauma. How can we use this medically? What does it do? Looking at the brain, this kind of thing. Or it's about indigenous wisdom that we can't really touch because maybe that's cultural appropriation. We can't really go there. So we're left in this kind of limbo land. So once we start to restory the world and think about non-Western epistemologies, in other words, non-Western ways of describing the connection between nature and mind, we get a very different story. So in the West, we tend to think of nature as out there, out the window. You go outside in nature, or nature is a sort of state, it's a sort of ecological stage on which things happen. We can introduce species or take invasive species away. What indigenous cultures are saying, well, it's not really a stage, it's a net. And it's a multi-dimensional net. Indra's net is a really good example. This idea that everything is connected, and the nodes represent the kind of beings of the kind of concentrations of being in the net. And again, touching into something that we can experience through the psychedelic world. And Aboriginal dream time. So that changes the way we think about nature. It's not a load of things out there. It's actually a connection, and we're connected. And this touches again into this experience of psychedelics, of connection feelings, emotion, and also the fact that nature's not just out there, it's also in us as well. So if we're thinking about nature as a net of which we're part, then it changes the role of nature within the psychedelic experience. So we know that nature is a great setting for psychedelics because it's generally safe, it's supportive. If you can access nature in a supported way, we also know that we can bring nature into a clinical setting, and that's helpful, seeing natural objects. But both of those viewpoints are somewhat changed if we think that actually we are part of this, part of Indra's net, and when we drop into that psychedelic space, or even when we're out in nature without psychedelics, we're touching into this multi-dimensional communication net. But of course, climate change is on the horizon. You know, what's been happening in California, in LA, is really, really devastating, and this is a result of climate change, of the meta crisis. So, you know, people fly off here and there, everywhere to do psychedelics, and there's a question of like, well, how does that fit with the meta crisis? What's the connection between psychedelics and the meta crisis? And I suppose where I've got to with this is that it's our broken systemic attachment with nature that is at the root of the ecological crisis. And psychedelics has the potential to reconnect us with nature at a very deep level. And that the fact that we're separated from nature enables some of the terrible ecological things to happen, because people are in this post-enlightenment intellectual space. They're not feeling viscerally that they're connected to the net. They have a story which is very intellectualized, if you like. So if we're thinking about psychedelics and nature and ecopsychotherapy, then we need to think about nature differently. You know, a bit like when I went to university and they said, oh, this is biology. I was going, actually, this isn't what I do when I go out into the woods and stomp around looking for animal skulls. This, you know, there's a more visceral connection that you're not really talking about. And this is Maria Sabina, Maztec shaman and poet, famous for introducing the world to psychedelic mushrooms. And she says, there is a world beyond our world. That world talks, has a language of its own. Language, we're into language again. They're not speaking English, those plants. You know, they're speaking a language which is difficult which is outside the parameters of our Western language. And I was listening to a podcast the other day about a woman who's a scientist who started to make contact with plant spirits in her garden in Australia. And she said, the plants started to talk to me. In other words, I had thoughts in my head that weren't coming from me. And she recognized they were coming from the plants, and then she was able to follow that track. So if we're going to reimagine nature, we've got to recognize that nature is somebody. Nature is a being. And with indigenous cultures, animism, in other words, the idea that nature is alive, is normative consciousness. It's normal. So from that perspective, we're living in a materialistic worldview, modernity, where that's considered weird or woo-woo or something. And actually, that's a very, you know, that's a very narrow time that we've been thinking about that. And actually, that is actually breaking down now. And, you know, example being this woman who was a scientist who's now talking to plants. I've written a book about it. So how the hell do we find nature's forgotten language? I mean, you can have those experiences like the Australian woman did, but it's also embedded in some thinkers that, you know, the ground has been laid for this, particularly through the Batesons, Gregory Bateson, who's written about this. It's quite difficult to understand because it's off-piste. It's off-piste in terms of language. so he's describing here, if we want to talk about the living world and ourselves, we need to master this curious language which has no things in it, only differences and relationships. So there's no things, only difference in relationships. So and he calls this language creator, in fact, but actually you may be more familiar with it in terms of the imaginal world. In other words, this world which is made up of images, which has no things in it, though it's got no nouns, words, it's ineffable, back to the psychedelic experience, and it's invisible. And again, that again, from the psychedelic experience, you see a lot of things, but not with your eyes, it's with the inner eyes. So the imaginal world, this is a shameless quote from my book. So the imaginal world, what is the imaginal world? Well, it's not widely known in contemporary Western culture that it is possible to open a threshold to the imaginal world, a part of the imagination that exists beyond the reach of both our sensory perceptions and our rational thinking. It is possible to, let's go back to that one. It is possible to reach the imaginal world through dream work, that experience I had in the Pyrenees, meditation, you can get in there, meditation, ritual fasting, vision quest, trance dancing, ceremonies in nature, some types of psychotherapy, not all types of psychotherapy, psychedelic medicine, and poetry. So imaginal practice, what does that look like? How do we work in the imaginal? Well, one of the really good ways to do that in groups is through talking and counsel. And it's one of the things we do on the retreats. So it's working in circle, sharing circles, because that's how indigenous people learn from each other. It's about opening a heart space, and it's about having a protocol which has a talking piece. And they've got a fluffy turtle. We don't have a fluffy turtle talking piece, but it's the talking piece isn't that important. It's the protocol that's important, and you learn that protocol, and you can drop in really, really deep with that. Maps and territories. Well, Snow White, you remember Snow White? Well, one of the things that's come out of the rites of passage work is that within Western Europe, a lot of the traditional stories were maps of initiatory pathways, and Snow White is an example, because what we have throughout the world, where we look at these initiatory maps, these developmental mapping tools, they have these colors: black, white, red, yellow, and that's, you remember, for Snow White, just white skin as white as the snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as the raven. I don't know where the yellow came in on that one, but the stories are imaginal. You can imagine stories as an imaginal compass to track these Western initiatory mapping tools or paths. So again, although we can recognize them in indigenous cultures, to avoid cultural appropriation, it's important to look in our cultures, our own cultures, and say, well, where were these in our old cultures? And they still exist, even in some of the traditional stories. So this is the work of Bill Plotkin, who started to put together soul-centric, ecocentric developmental mapping tools, where he was able to track different stages of human development from a ecosystemic perspective, if you like. And this one here, stage 4, is the one that's, I think, important for psychedelics, because it's soul initiation. And soul initiation moves us from late adolescence to early adulthood. And that's not about chronology, that's about psychological development. So the late adolescence is the wanderer in the cocoon, which is the name. These are imaginal titles, so they give you an image of something. Leaving home, exploring the mysteries, mystery and darkness, gravity, the underworld. So if you can think of people who are a bit lost, particularly adolescents who have had troubled experiences, or adults who have had troubled experiences, quite often there's this lostness of like, what am I supposed to do with my life? Where am I going? Drawing into this underworld work. And he talks about the post-initiation is really getting a sense of getting a pointer to what we're supposed to be doing, who we are. And again, that's available through some of these different technologies. And that's about vision, reaction, and inspiration. In other words, you're an apprentice at the wellspring. You found a wellspring of your own interest, and you're learning from that rather than wandering around. So that's just a touching into that, and that's in the West. And then there's the deeper process of reconnecting to nature as the great mother. And I'll put that in there because it's kind of provocative, rather than reconnecting with nature as the ecosystem or whatever it is. The great mother is how indigenous cultures have experienced nature for millennia, and also it's something that's accessible through the psychedelic experience. So cultural practices that facilitate an intersubjective connection with the systemic intelligence of the earth. In other words, you plug into something that's talking to you, and it's intelligent, it's more intelligent than you, and you can learn from it. And it's a lifelong process, probably more than one lifelong. So the deep nature connection practices, using imaginal language as a psychotechnology through vision fast. This is Bill Plotkin's work, using fasting in nature and using the mirroring, imaginal mirroring of stories, so people begin to understand that language out of our head. We drop into the heart. And what Bill says is that the roots of our mental health are not psychological or medical, but ecological. So that it's about our connection or not with the earth that gives us our mental health. The one we have is the other psychotechnology, ceremony and ritual. And again, we think, well, that's kind of indigenous stuff. We can't really touch that, but actually through our own practice of trying out these things, it's relatively easy to open up a space where you're communicating with the earth. So self-generated ritual and ceremony, in other words, you create the ceremony in a playful way, and you can use different structures and forms for that. It opens gateways to working with this imaginal space. And then initiatory rites of passage, something I've trained in, prolonged ritual solo time in nature. So this can be 4 days and nights without food as a ritual solo. You can do it in 15 minutes. I've done this with my men's group. I've done it at the eco-psychology workshop, 15 minutes. As long as you provide the right container for it, people go in really deep and come back with new insights into their own life. And these are 2 websites that offer rites of passage work. And the School of Lost Borders is the one I trained in. So there's a task really, which is hospicing modernity. And I didn't touch this. I can say a little bit more about hospicing modernity. But hospicing modernity is allowing modernity, the modern way of seeing the world through the head, as seeing the world as a kind of dead rock. How we can allow that way of seeing the world to die gracefully, not to kind of smash it down, but allow it to pass on, so that we can regain a more animistic or a new animistic way of connecting with nature. And we can do this through nature-based practice, and we can also do it through psychedelics, and they cross over, they talk to each other. So it now seems vital that Western culture, and again, this is shameless book promotion, it now seems vital that Western culture re-engages with those psychotechnologies, not through cultural appropriation of indigenous practice to support our failing Western lifestyle, but through a contemporary hermeneutic process, a communication process, a hermeneutic process of deep listening for a radically reimagined ecological approach to psychotherapy. So that takes us to the psychedelic experience, and it moves it away from about healing trauma and healing from a medical model, and it's talking about psychedelic medicine in service of nature. In other words, by dropping into that psychedelic space and communicating with the systemic intelligence of the earth, where we're in communication with the earth at a very deep level, and in a sense helping to heal the earth at a time of really, really dire need. So it's psychedelic medicine in service of nature rather than in service of individual mental health, which is that kind of individualized Western model. So that's the end. Just 2 more slides. One is this is the retreat that they were talking about, the Numinous retreat we're doing in Portugal, and there's also a soul and nature workshop I'm doing in August, which is similar progress but doesn't involve any psychedelics.
Great, thank you, Roger.
It's the end.
Thank you very much. I really.
How do I stop sharing?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can stop sharing, Christoph, can you?
Thank you. That was our opportunity to do some questions and answers. So if anybody's got any questions that they'd like to ask Roger, or if there's any questions that they'd like to ask of the facilitators or Numinous Ways, then please direct them to us. We're here, we're ready and waiting. So if anybody's a bit too shy to speak, then just stick it in the chat and I'll do it for you. Christian, you're muted still, so.
Hello, thank you so much for the talking. I'm hearing you here from Mexico. So
wow.
It is very nice to hear how are you working in the other part of the world. Well, as you already know, here in Mexico we have a deep root into psychedelic plants and fungi medicine. And well, actually, I was very curious about some of your last slides when you were talking about hospicing the modernity through nature-based practice and psychedelics, because it is a very fine line of how to re-engage through these psychotechnologies, but not falling with the cultural appropriation. So you say that you need, well, all of us needs to make a contemporary hermeneutic process of deep listening. But I was curious just about that. How can we make this a contemporary hermeneutic process without falling with the appropriation of indigenous practice? What are the main points to make this hermeneutic process without falling in the appropriation of the indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, no, I think that it's a really good topic, and I've explored this quite a bit. And there seems to be two kind of camps from indigenous scholars about cultural appropriation. One is, this is cultural appropriation. You can't have our stuff because you've stolen everything else, and this is the last thing. And there's another camp which is led by Four Arrows, who's an indigenous scholar, I think in Mexico. I think he lives in Mexico, who says, actually, we've got to share this stuff because it's too important. So that is, and I think from a Western perspective, we kind of dance between those two. And what I've done is a mixture of those two. I've learned from indigenous practices. I've studied a lot of indigenous ideas, but also the route I had initially into this work was through Western esotericism, through Rudolf Steiner, which is quite old-fashioned and quite narrow. But actually, once you get into the practice of that, then you can find your way in. And I suppose the other way was through psychedelics. Well, Vision Quest, that I trained with the School of Lost Borders, and again that was a training that was gifted to that group by indigenous elders in that region. So that was a gateway into it. And then more recently, since I revisited psychedelics, being able to drop into that space myself and begin to navigate that space, and have a mentor who can also help me with that. So it's delicate work, but it's kind of essential. So that's kind of where my work, that's where the cutting edge of my work is now. It's like, how do you share this without the cultural appropriation element, and how do you draw on Western lineages to drop into this work? And one of the places you can do that through Gregory Bateson, and Henri Corbin is another one. But again, it's quite complicated. If you come at it through an intellectual perspective, it's a real mind bender. But once you get into the experience of it, even if it's just a faint sense of a dream, or faint sense of being in connection with animals outside, you can run with that, you can work with that. But it takes a really long time. You know, I've been doing this my whole life, and I'm 65, and I'm just beginning to get it. You know.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you said just very particular and special keys to develop these self-generated rituals. In March here in Mexico, it's gonna be an event to reunite all the leaders and the grandfathers of the continent of America, to talk about several problems and to discuss how to work and to reunite not only the Apia Yala, that is the ancient name of America, but also the world. And they are actually debating how to make this reunification, not only in the humanity, but with all the nature, in special ways, to not falling in the indigenous appropriation, but also to share this knowledge. So this is more of the actual topics and problematics that we live here in Mexico and in America, in the indigenous cultures, and it's very interesting to see how you are resolving these topics, and it will be fantastic to keep in touch to make this reunification of the humanity and the nature.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Great to call in. Great that you're calling in from Mexico. And I suppose again, one of the ways in with the self-generated ritual and ceremony is, when you first do that, it feels like you're faking it. But you know, it just feels like you're making something up. You're pretending. But actually, what I've found is, when you drop into that space, the more authentically you drop into that space, the more authentically nature begins to go, oh yeah, I'm showing up. So that's, you know, I think it is accessible to all of us. And again, that's a theme that comes through with a lot of indigenous writers that are coming out now, right? This, you know, in the last 5 or 10 years, saying this is available for everybody. Everyone needs to do this. You know, so it's an exciting time, really, and it's a bit of a scary time because we haven't got a lot of time left to fix it.
Please share that event with us. Please let us know if there's any way that we can find out about it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Sam.
Hi, Christian, I just loved what you communicated and Roger's response as well. Just thinking about how I was in a really kind of colonialized part of the UK called Cirencester, in a park, and I was under a tree studying German literature at the time, and this kind of poem came to me, and it felt that it came to me from the tree, and I was like, well, how did that happen? Because I didn't have, other than having a partly Steiner education, I didn't have a framework for a tree giving me a poem. And it's like, in a sense, that's my answer to the indigenous question, or that the challenge around that is that the body is the indigenous if we can find it. But colonization is also continuous. So we're continually being bombarded by messaging and messages to take us away from that which we are, which we can't actually be separate from, because that's the wisdom. And what I wonder is about the loss of our cultural, our oral heritage, and how we find that. And it seems that psychedelics, particularly psychedelic mushrooms for me, seem to hold those stories. So it's almost like the earth giving the stories back in a similar way to how the tree gave me a poem. And so I wondered, Roger, whether you wanted to, talk more about that.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about the book that's just come out called, I think it's just come out, there's a podcast on it called Thus Spoke the Plant, which is about this, which is by an Italian woman who lives in Italy, who talks about how she's developed this sense of talking with plants. But again, it's outside our cultural narrative. If you go to school or go to work and say, "Hey, I talk to the trees," well, they'll think you're a nutcase. Whereas again, one of the books I was reading on listened to an Audible just the other day, which is called Kinship something, I can't remember what it's called. Anyway, it's about an indigenous lady who's talking about practices, and she talked about in the West we have a lot of body-based practices, which would come from the East, of course, meditation, mindfulness, body scans. But she says within indigenous practice, that's extended into nature. So you think about your body, but then you think about the earth, and then you think about the sky and the trees and the animals and the plants and the birds. And she said, you open that, so the practice is to check in with the whole of the cosmos. And actually, that's not a very common practice in Western culture. But as I said, it's a slow process. It's like meditation. If you do that every day, people show up, characters show up.
Anybody else? Anybody else got any questions?
That's the one. Thus spoke the plant. You got it there.
I've got a question.
Great.
Hi, Roger.
Hi.
My question's kind of about who these practices are for, and how can they be accessed, and where do you think they should be accessed, and in what settings, and is this for personal exploration, or are we going to be, am I going to get some shrooms from my local drug dealer and go and do this, or is it is it in contained, safe settings, and how do we pay for that? How do we afford that if we don't have much money or time?
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, that's a great question. Well, I think they're for everybody, but I think psychedelic exploration is advanced work. Certainly has been for me. It's something I'll come back to later in life, because there are lots of layers. There are lots of other things we need to do. First of all, one is get a new story, get rid of the colonial story and realize how pervasive that is, and go, okay, wow, okay, yeah, I'm shut out of the world through language. Let's see if we can correct that. The other one is healing trauma. Oh dear, I'm shut out of the world because I'm dissociated. I've got to sort all that out. And then once you've got a sense of once you've healed the trauma and you've got a sense of a new language, then it's possible to start talking to the plants, having some communication. And the issue that again I've been working with for quite a while is, it's available for everybody. This kind of stuff was available for every adolescent in every indigenous culture throughout the whole world forever until 2,500 years ago. So where should it be now? Well, it should be in the NHS, of course, but they don't have a map. They don't have an initiatory map. They've got a medical model map, and it doesn't get through the nice guidelines. But one day, if NHS lasts that long, it may. It needs to be free at point of delivery, because that's what initiation was.
Thank you.
Sure, we've got a few more questions.
He's brave enough. Anybody got another question they'd like to ask Roger?
I can follow up on my question quickly
Great,
while
brilliant.
someone thinks of another question. So it sounds like you would like, there's like a cultural shift that needs to happen in conjunction with individuals who have the opportunity to experience psychedelic initiation. There's also got to be this kind of wider cultural shift that's going on, so that, for example, the NHS invites these kinds of practices. And any sort of take-home ways for this to be happening? I guess sharing, talking, you know, there's ways to do it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I mean, what I've been exploring is exactly that, is the healing trauma, because most people, you know, there was another podcast I listened to actually, which was basically saying what's interesting about the ayahuasca experience is that the Amazon, taking the psychedelics in the Amazon, I can't remember exactly who this was, but they were saying quite a lot, the focus of Western people quite often is about healing trauma, finding their original trauma. So it's backward looking. How can I fix myself so I can? And they were saying that traditionally ayahuasca in indigenous cultures, it's forward looking. What do I need to do? Where do I need to go? So it's not, we're not held back by something. It's about traveling. It's about traveling in the world and how we make a difference. So I think that's an interesting shift, because actually the question is, how do we save the planet? And what can I do about it? You know, that's a great question to ask a wider intelligence. And of course, the AI is a kind of poor version of what the systemic intelligence of the Earth really is. It's like a robot version. It's like a sort of Pinocchio version of what's really going on. So, and a lot of people are kind of caught up with that.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's a little. Well, I will go for it.
Go
Two
for it.
questions, actually. The first one: do you think that you won't? Do you think we will arrive where you are now without the psychedelic, or do you call that connection to nature and going back to this speaking, hearing without the psychedelic? And the second question is, for me, the psychedelic used in Western country is colonization, because it's not the way, neither the environment, neither the story that it embodied. So is there any other psychedelic or things that in Europe were used in that are not coming from other country, but like
Yes,
in
absolutely. Yes, there's a lot of psychedelics that are used in England, but so the psilocybin mushrooms, the amanita mushrooms, a lot of the witch potions, hemlock, henbane, all that kind of stuff. People knew how to do it. When you look in the biology books, it's just like poison, don't eat it. But actually people knew how to work with that kind of stuff. Can you reach it without psychedelics? Absolutely. But if you've grown up in a Western culture, the Western narrative, there's a lot of baggage to shift. And what psychedelics does is it cuts through that quite quickly, which makes it quite difficult. But I think that's the value. And what's interesting is there's this kind of resurgence in psychedelics. And again, one of the things that Vanessa Andreotti said when the South American tribes, who she's in contact with, opened up ayahuasca to the West, they said, "Hey, come on, let's open this up to the West." They expected that the Western people would come back from the experience, say, wow, we've got to save the rainforest and save the planet. And they said, well, that never happened. That didn't happen because there was a whole lot of baggage, transgenerational trauma or whatever it was, which meant, oh, they're just right at the beginning. They're still looking back to sort out stuff rather than going, right, now I'm going to, whereas people who've grown up in indigenous cultures, that was language, the stories enabled them, and the maps and the cosmologies enabled them to access that more quickly. Yeah, you can. I mean, you can, if you do shamanic work without psychedelics. Yeah, you can get very similar experiences. Sometimes even more powerful.
Yeah, and breath work as well.
Breath work as well.
Really do a great experience on breath work. It's really interesting what you say at the end. It's exactly that. It's like using something that it's not related to our story, which doesn't fit together, which we are not prepared there. So one thinks that we will be saving the planet, and the other is like, we're not ready to save the planet because we need to clean all up before.
Yeah, it's a threshold time. It's a threshold time.
Thank you.
Let's go to Flora before her hand drops off.
Hi, Flora.
Thank you, Roger. This was so interesting. I have two questions. One of them was, I'd like to know how you feel about LSD and other synthetic psychedelics and their place in this. And the other question was, as someone I've looked quite extensively into doing like psychedelic facilitation training and stuff like this, but felt kind of like, yeah, I'm just curious how you feel about someone doing a training like that without any kind of like psychological training to deal with people in vulnerable spaces working with trauma and stuff, and how do you feel like someone can contribute to facilitating those very vulnerable situations working with trauma without training in trauma?
Okay, two questions. The synthetic ones are gateways to the imaginal. They just haven't come out of the plant. So it's something like LSD. Richard Bache took a whole lot of very, very high doses of LSD over like 20-year period. And again, he was his book's called LSD and the Mind of God. So basically, he was plugging in to an imaginal reality, the systemic intelligence of the earth. So it's not just through plant medicine, but I think with the plants you get extra goodies. In other words, you've got plants that are helping you out rather than just a chemical. In terms of training, it's a difficult one because it's an emerging field, but I think because it's quite complex, I think the more training you can get, the better. So particularly, I think the psychotherapy training is really important. But I don't, there's, as I said, the training's evolving. Just get as much as you can, really, that works for you.
Thank you.
John, should I see that you've raised your hand?
Yeah, thanks so much for the talks. Yeah, really interesting ideas you're marrying together. Feels like the Eagle Condor prophecy coming in action from a Western lens. I just wanted to ask a really honest question around balancing the idea around getting away from colonialist ideas through nature-based eco-psychotherapy and then like charging capitalist lent prices for the retreats, if that makes sense. How you going to marry that up?
Yeah, it's tricky. It's a tricky one. But yeah, I just hang out with the difficulty of that one. And the other option would be to not do it or to do it illegally, both,
Yeah.
which aren't that great, really.
Okay.
Yeah, I struggle with that one, but partly it's, you know, partly it's about trying to reach people that is future oriented. From my perspective, it's future orientated. It's reaching people who might be able to develop these practices in the future, and you know, and if they become legal, then that you know, they potentially could develop different structures, but we're not there yet because we're still stuck in a colonial mindset.
I see. Thanks for sharing.
But yeah, tricky, good question.
Thank you, John. Andrew.
Thanks. Thanks, Roger. Fascinating talk. Can I ask, have you any experience of combining psychedelics with Joanna Macy's work that reconnects, and in particular running workshops in which psychedelics are incorporated into going through her spiral? I haven't. And to be honest, I haven't done a lot of work with Joanna. I haven't done a lot of work with Joanna Macy's ideas or concepts. My main work, just because of my own journey, has been how do I plug into nature? How do I communicate with nature directly? And to minimize intellectual frame. That's what I'm interested in, minimizing intellectual frameworks or structural frameworks. Having said that, there's a few frameworks in the rites of passage work, but again, it's stripping them down to so you can listen in. But so really good questions. Probably really interesting work to do, and maybe it's probably something for an individual. If that was something you're interested in, it's probably worth exploring for yourself. Thank you. Yeah, will do. Got one more. Come on, one more question.
Yeah, just one more. It could also be about sharing your experience of your connection with nature. It doesn't have to just be us answering questions, but if you have some insights or something you'd like to share. Emma Jane.
Sorry, I told you I'm not very, that's it. No, I just wanted to say my background is herbalism. I'm one of the witchy potion people. And I've never used psychedelic. But I've studied a lot of the use of henbane and things like that. And it fascinates. Now I sort of, my thing is that I do connect with nature. I am one of those people that go to work and say, I was talking to the trees. But that's just over years of most of my plants and my trees I've grown from seed that I've collected while foraging. My background, I suppose, would be witchcraft, cunning folk, because I'm a herbalist. I make healing teas and things like that. So I've just found the whole thing fascinating. That's all I really wanted to say. Like I say, I've only just started to get into thinking about psychedelics because of herbs like the henbane and things like that. And it's kind of, I'm aware of what other cultures use, but I'm more interested in what would be used sort of by cunning folk, of past, when we were much more connected with nature. So yeah, that I just wanted to say I found the whole thing fascinating and the different aspects.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
So thank you.
Thanks very much.
Can I just quickly come in on the costs of the retreats? Because I was thinking, the retreats don't really make money. If you want to make money, you need to go into gas and oil extraction, which is kind of like a terrible thing given what we're talking about here. It just costs quite a lot to provide them. And as Roger said, like well, there is underground work, but that carries a lot of difficulties with it. And then there's not to do it at all, which is an option. But is that ethical, given that psychedelics can really take us to a place beyond that colonized mind? Yeah, so I just wanted to kind of pop that thought in, really. And then yeah, that's just kind of the landscape that we find ourselves in. And there's also a number of charities that are working really hard to develop equity in access. So there's a charity called PAR, Psilocybin Access Rites, and others who are collecting signatures to try and change the law on this. And yeah, so there's lots of good work going on in this arena, including with drug science, who are really trying to change the laws around the drug laws in order to reduce the harm that the current laws are doing, not just in this country, but also in the Americas and other places. So yeah, I just wanted to put that in there.
Thanks, Dan.
Some interesting papers that people are sticking up. Thanks, folks. Add this to my portfolio. Which is the plant that we were speaking about, Elodie? Henbane. There's a few like Amanita, Datura. The psilocybin mushrooms as well. Oh, I can see.
Oh,
Come on, James.
I just wanted to come in just to thank Roger. That was just really, really, really good. Really found it very interesting, very knowledgeable, and yeah, it really connects with me. I think I've been probably listening to quite a lot of the same podcasts as you have, Roger.
Yeah, you probably have.
And it's absolutely fascinating. I'm just gutted I won't be able to make it to the retreat in March.
April.
I was lucky enough to go on a retreat previously.
Great.
And it was amazing. And when you were talking about the inner nature, when I was on the retreat, during my journey, shall we say, I never went outside at all. I stayed inside, but just the connection to nature I had in my own head and what I've felt since is pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one of the kind of misleading, one of the ideas in eco-psychotherapy, for instance, is you need to go outside to connect with nature, but that you're already creating this divide that there's an outside and inside. There isn't. It's just all outside. There just happens to be loads of man-made stuff or human-made stuff in here that's blocking my view. And of course, and when you get to the inner world, it's all the same stuff. So yeah, I think spot on with that one.
Thank you.
I can see that there's some requests in the chat for any sort of podcasts or recommendations. So if anybody's got any, or if you've got some, Roger, and there's also share your slides as well.
Yes, I think I can share my slides.
Okay, so if people just drop their emails down, if they'd like to have the slides, or if anybody's got any connection to some great podcasts or recommendations for podcasts, please do share it in the chat.
Yeah, Flourishing Kin is the other book I mentioned. I don't know if you can find Flourishing Kin by there. That's the woman who is talking about indigenous practices of connecting with the more than human world. So again, doing that, like doing a meditation, but really checking in with all the other folks. You know, the ones above, below, north, south, east, west, and all the individual characters as well. And how, you know, what happens when you do that. Do you find Flourishing Kin, Danny?
Got it. Just got to make sure I don't misspell her name.
So yeah, she's a Mexican. She's been working in the United Nations for 20 years, trying to get this stuff, you know, trying to get indigenous thinking into the United Nations. It's pretty impressive, really.
Marvelous. So we've got quite a few emails down there. Thank you. I think, is there anybody for the last question before we wrap up things? Bring this to a close this lovely evening.
We'd love some podcast recommendations as well as the books. Does anyone remembers the names? They're always welcome.
Okay, let me just podcast. Sand is always good. Sand, Science and Non-Duality. Future Fossils is a good one, pretty far out. Great Simplification, Nate Hagen is a good one. Accidental Gods is a good one. Lots of psychedelic ones, Psychedelic Today and stuff like that. Psychedelic Podcast. What else have we got?
Goldmine, thank you.
Oh, The Emerald is bloody amazing. Oh, and in Conversation with Natalie Nahai is fantastic. An Entangled World, that's it. Entangled World is the other one.
Okay, that looks like a feast. You're gonna be
good luck with that lot.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. So let's wrap things up. I just want to say a big thank you for everybody for being here, giving up your time on this evening. Just if you've got any other questions, anything that you want to direct to us, then just look at our website, Numinous Ways. If you'd like to leave any questions for Roger Duncan as well, or we'll pass on the information. So, lovely to meet you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Take care, and hopefully see you again. So keep an eye out for our invitations to webinars. Also, there's opportunities to contact us around our integration services and psychedelic services. Have a look at our retreats, particularly Roger's one, because it's going to be great. And just keep in touch. So we also do integration circles as well. So to come along to our Numinous dialogues. So anybody needs any information, just contact us. Good evening, everybody.